Right. Today I want to talk about Buddhism, especially as it relates to origins. Um, in world religions, we can talk more about some of the different sects and practices of the Buddhist tradition. But let me start by saying Buddhism is to Hinduism as Christianity is to Judaism. And what I mean by that is just as Christians see themselves as a continuation of the monistic Abrahamic tradition, and they see Jesus as a fulfillment of the promises found in what Christians call the Old Testament. The Jews call it the Tanakh, the first 5 books being the Torah. But Christians see Jesus as being God incarnate and fulfilling promises made all the way back in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And similarly, in Hinduism, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in roughly the 6th century in northern India, perhaps present day, but the Buddha was born into a royal family. He wasn't the Buddha, of course, at the time, Siddhartha Gautama. His father, on his birth, it reminds me a lot of the birth of Jesus. There were signs, there were omens, there were portents, there were visions, and a holy man came, which reminds me of Simeon in the Bible, who asked to see the Christ child before he died. And at the temple, when Jesus his parents had brought him for this circumcision, Simeon got to hold him and was so excited but also sad because he realized this was going to be the savior of the world. Similarly, when Siddhartha Gautama was born, a holy man, a sage seer, came and he held the little child, and he told Siddhartha's father, who was a king, he said, "Your son will either become a great warlord that will combine the kingdoms of the subcontinent, or he will become the savior of the world, a spiritual man, someone to help take away pain and suffering." And his father, being a king, said, "Well, that's great. We'll take option 1. Thank you very much." And the holy man said, "You can pick what you want, but fate is not always what we desire or choose." And so the holy man left. Shortly thereafter, Siddhartha's mother died, and his father raised him in such a way as to not to have any religious sensibilities. So he raised him in statecraft. He sated him with pleasure. He gave him his every desire. He had summer palaces, winter palaces. He had a beautiful wife, and he had just had a child. But as Siddhartha got older and had lived this charmed life, kept from all pain and suffering or anything that would cause him to have a questioning or inquisitive mind on why am I here? What is the meaning or purpose of life? What happens to us when we die? Why do the innocent suffer? Siddhartha wasn't struggling with any of those typical human questions or dilemmas. But as he got older and had his first child, he realized, I don't even know my own kingdom. How am I supposed to rule? And so he told his father, I need to see my people. And so his father, being very clever, put kind of like a facade down the main street of the capital city. And he gave the residents new clothes. He put on a feast so they'd all have greasy lips and be happy and satisfied. And they threw this huge coming out parade for Siddhartha, who, riding on an elephant, rode through the town to cheers and accolades and all the happy, smiling people. Yeah, it wasn't as nice as the palace, but the people were fed, they were clothed, they seemed happy. Siddhartha was so taken by the joys of his newfound kingdom he got to explore for the first time that he snuck it out again later with his servant. But this time the facade was gone, the party was over, the fancy clothes had been put away, and people had returned to their life of drudgery. And if you can imagine what life must have been like in 6th century India. What Siddhartha saw this time was very different than the beautiful colors and the sounds of the music and the smells of the incense, but now he could see and smell and hear the real sounds of the everyday city. And the first thing he noticed was some old people. Siddhartha had never even seen old people before because his father didn't want him to realize people got old and died. This young man had never been exposed to old age, let alone death. And so he asked his servant, "What's wrong with these people? Why are they all wrinkly and hunched over?" And his servant said, "They're old, Siddhartha. Old age comes to all of us." And Siddhartha says, "Even to a prince?" And his servant said, "Yes, Siddhartha, even to a prince." The next person they met was someone that was sick, and they were screaming in agony and pain. They had some terrible disease. And Siddhartha had never been around someone who was sick or had a chronic illness or disease. And he asked his servant, "What's wrong with that person?" And the servant said, "They're sick, Siddhartha. No one passes from birth to death without being sick at least once in their life." And Siddhartha said, "Even princes?" And his servant said, "Yes, Siddhartha, even princes." And so Siddhartha said, "Show me this death." And so his servant took him down to the river where they took the dead bodies. And his servant said, "Just as wood, when it is dry, is cast into the flames to be burned, so too, when humans die, we dry out, we become stiff, and we too must be burned in the fire." And Siddhartha said, "Even princes?" And his servant said, "Yes, Siddhartha, even princes." And then the fourth thing Siddhartha, or person Siddhartha, saw on that day, after seeing old age, sickness, and death, was he saw a sadhu. And a sadhu is a holy man, ascetic, a Hindu ascetic. And if you remember, ascetics are people who believe that by depriving the physical body, you can release the soul or spirit. So these people practice extreme forms of fasting, feats of discomfort. They might sit for years in front of a boulder, basically becoming like a rock, or next to a creosote bush in the desert, just swaying with the bush and the breeze, becoming one with the breeze, living off of water droplets, water raindrops, or bird droppings. And it was a hard life, but the idea was, if this physical vehicle we're in is illusion, or if it's transitory, if it's passing, let's minimize our care and focus on this body. Let's let the sex, drugs, and rock and roll go, and let's focus on these eternal things of the mind, of the spirit, these things that transcend the body. And so he meditated for years with these sadhus, but then one day during his meditation, he heard a teacher, it was a music teacher, teaching his student how to play. And it was a sitar, which it's like a guitar, but it has more strings, more range. And the teacher told the student, he said, "If you tighten the string too tight, it will snap. But if it's too loose, you cannot play." And Siddhartha Gautama had like an aha moment at that point, and he realized you have to avoid extremes. You can reckon either ditch. The ditch of extreme austerity and asceticism, or the ditch of libertinism and indulging the senses. And so what he developed is what's called the Buddha's middle way. And the middle way was to avoid these extremes. That was the path to enlightenment. It reminds me a lot of Aristotle's virtue ethics, this idea of we need to let go of the excess and the deficiencies in our life. And Siddhartha vowed that he was going to meditate, to fast and meditate, and practice this ascetic lifestyle until he found the answer to human suffering. And this culminated under the Bodhi tree, where he had a 40-day fast. Sound familiar? Okay. Remember, this is about 600 years before Christ, or Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, but the parallels are quite stunning. So here's Siddhartha fasting for 40 days and nights under the Bodhi tree. He's rejected this idea of extreme asceticism, or let go and let Godism, and he's trying to find this balanced middle way. And what he's realizing is, just like we talked about the Hindu deconstruction of the self, that thousand-petaled lotus of the heart, where you're deconstructing your roles and your relationships, that Siddhartha isn't just a son, right? He isn't just a teacher. He isn't just a Hindu. He isn't just from the subcontinent of India, but there's an essential core self beyond all of that. And in this deconstruction process, as he comes to the last petal, this last challenge, the whole time he's going through this process, the Lord of Darkness, of illusion, Mara, is trying to tempt him. And just like the temptations of Jesus, Mara has, in this sense, the vices are personified as like the daughters of Mara, where you have lust, jealousy, pride, greed, gluttony, all these different vices or appeals to the flesh to bind us to this world of illusion. And one by one, Siddhartha rejected them. He could not be enticed, either through pleasure or deterred by fear. He was going to follow this path to the end. And that last pedal, that last deconstruction he had to undo was his own ego. Because your ego is the ultimate trap to hold you into this world of illusion. And so the Buddhist practice coming out of this is called annihilation of the self, where you literally have to put to death your own ego. You have to get rid of it if you want to have any hope of this universal cosmic mind. And so with that last pedal, where Siddhartha rejects his own ego, and in the movie The Little Buddha, it's a great line. He said, "O Lord of my own ego, I see and declare you as pure illusion." And as he does this, all the illusion fades away and he becomes one with the universal mind. But in order to be one with the universal mind, you have to lose your individual egocentric mind. So that is the Buddha's death of self. And in dying to self, you can be connected to everything. And that is, reaching that place of nothingness is another way of talking about reaching a place of everythingness.